My name is Javier Ramirez. I'm a warehouse manager who survived the first month of the Ice Age apocalypse. When Yellowstone erupted on October 15th, 2024, temperatures in Denver dropped 50 degrees in 2 weeks. I had to keep 43 people alive in my frozen distribution center while making impossible decisions about who lived and who died. This is my story. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. My name is Javier Ramirez, and I am a warehouse manager who survived the first month of the Ice Age apocalypse. Before October 15th, 2024, my biggest concern was explaining to corporate headquarters why our distribution numbers were slightly behind projections. I managed the Regional Foods Distribution Center in Commerce City, just northeast of Denver, Colorado. 200,000 square feet of organized chaos, coordinating food deliveries to over 300 grocery stores across Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. I had been working at that facility for 12 years, starting as a dock loader fresh out of high school and climbing my way up through sheer determination and an obsessive attention to detail. My colleagues used to joke that I could tell you the exact location of any product in our warehouse just by closing my eyes and thinking about it. I knew every aisle, every shelf, every loading bay like the back of my hand. What I did not know was that this intimate knowledge of inventory management and logistics would become the difference between life and death for dozens of people. The morning of October 15th started like any other Tuesday. I arrived at the warehouse at 6:15 in the morning, coffee in hand, ready to review the weekly delivery schedules and coordinate with our truck drivers. The autumn air was crisp but comfortable, around 52 degrees according to my weather app. I remember checking it specifically because I was planning our outdoor loading operations for the day. The sky was clear, with just a few scattered clouds on the western horizon. I had been keeping a closer eye on our winter inventory than usual that year. There had been reports in the trade magazines about potential supply chain disruptions, labor strikes at some major food processing plants, and transportation bottlenecks that could affect deliveries during the upcoming winter months. My supervisor had mentioned these concerns during our monthly meeting, but he had not seemed overly worried. I was the type of person who prepared for problems before they happened, though. Call it paranoia or call it prudence, but I had been quietly building up our emergency reserves and making sure our backup systems were functioning properly. Just the month before, we had completed an upgrade to our backup generator system and refrigeration units. The company had invested heavily in ensuring our facility could maintain operations even during power outages. I had personally overseen the installation and testing of these systems, making detailed notes in my emergency preparedness notebook about fuel consumption rates, capacity limits, and maintenance schedules. This notebook was something I had started keeping after a minor power outage 3 years earlier had taught me the importance of being ready for unexpected situations. At 6:47 that morning, I was sitting in my office reviewing the weekly reports when the ground started shaking. At first, I thought it was just another freight train passing by on the nearby railroad tracks. We were used to the occasional rumble from the trains, but this felt different. The shaking was more intense and lasted longer than usual. My coffee mug began rattling on my desk, and the fluorescent lights above started swaying back and forth. Then my phone buzzed with an emergency alert that I had never seen before. The message was stark and terrifying. Yellowstone supervolcano eruption, seek immediate shelter, avoid outdoor exposure, await further instructions. I stared at the screen for several seconds, trying to process what I was reading. Yellowstone was hundreds of miles away from Denver, but I knew enough about geology to understand that a supervolcano eruption would have consequences far beyond the immediate blast zone. I walked over to the large windows that overlooked our loading docks and parking area. The morning sky was beginning to change color. What had been a clear blue sky just minutes earlier was now taking on an ominous gray tint. From the northwest, I could see a massive dark cloud rolling toward us like a wall of smoke. It moved faster than any storm cloud I had ever witnessed, and it stretched across the entire horizon. The cloud was so dense and dark that it seemed to swallow the landscape as it approached. My first instinct was to check the news, but when I turned on the radio in my office, all I could find were emergency broadcasts repeating the same basic information. Yellowstone National Park had experienced what scientists were calling a supervolcano eruption. Ash clouds were spreading rapidly across the northwestern United States. Citizens were advised to stay indoors, seal windows and doors, and avoid breathing the ash-contaminated air. Within minutes, employees began arriving for the morning shift. I could see the confusion and fear on their faces as they parked their cars and hurried toward the building. The ash cloud was now directly overhead, and the temperature had already begun to drop noticeably. What had been a comfortable 52 degrees when I arrived was now closer to 45 degrees, and the air had taken on a thick, oppressive quality. Maria Santos, my assistant manager, was the first person to reach my office. She had been working with me for 8 years, and I had never seen her look so frightened. "Javi, what is happening out there?" she asked, pointing toward the windows. "The radio in my car was talking about some kind of eruption, and the sky looks like the end of the world." I showed her the emergency alert on my phone and explained what little I knew about the situation. As we talked, more employees gathered in my office, all asking the same questions and looking for answers that I did not have. The ash had begun falling outside, creating what looked like a heavy snowfall except that the flakes were gray and seemed to coat everything they touched with a fine, powdery residue. By 8 o'clock in the morning, we had about 20 employees in the building, roughly half of our normal morning shift. The others were presumably stuck at home or dealing with their own emergency situations. The ash was falling more heavily now, and visibility outside had dropped to maybe 50 feet. The parking lot, which had been clearly visible from my office windows an hour earlier, was now barely discernible through the gray haze. I made the decision to gather everyone in the main break room to discuss our situation. This was not a normal business day, and pretending otherwise would have been dangerous and irresponsible. As I looked at the faces of my employees, I realized that many of them were looking to me for guidance and leadership. These were people I had worked with for years, people whose families I knew, whose birthdays we celebrated, whose personal struggles I had helped them through. Now they needed me to help them navigate something none of us had ever experienced before. "Listen, everyone," I began, trying to keep my voice calm and steady. "We are dealing with a situation that none of us were prepared for, but we need to make some smart decisions right now. The emergency broadcasts are telling people to stay indoors and avoid exposure to the ash. Our building is solid, we have backup power, and we have access to food and water. I think the safest thing we can do right now is stay put and wait for more information." Some of the employees wanted to leave immediately to check on their families or to try to beat the worsening conditions. I understood their concerns, but I could also see that the situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees in just 2 hours, and the ash was creating hazardous driving conditions. Several people had already called to report that their cars were having trouble starting, or that they were stuck in traffic jams caused by reduced visibility. I suggested that anyone who wanted to leave should do so immediately, before conditions got worse, but that anyone who stayed would be welcome to shelter in the warehouse until the situation improved. This was not a decision I made lightly. I was essentially taking responsibility for the safety and welfare of anyone who chose to remain, and I knew that this responsibility could last much longer than any of us anticipated. 12 people decided to stay, including Maria and several of our most experienced workers. We also had 3 family members who had managed to reach the warehouse before the ash made travel too dangerous. Among them was Carlos Rivera, one of our forklift operators, whose wife and 8-year-old daughter had arrived just as the ash began falling heavily. His wife, Elena, worked as a school secretary, and their daughter Sophia had been sent home early when the schools closed due to the emergency. By noon, the temperature outside had dropped to 38 degrees, and the ash fall had intensified to the point where we could barely see the loading docks from inside the building. The radio broadcasts had become more frequent and more urgent. Scientists were using terms like nuclear winter and volcanic winter to describe the potential long-term effects of the eruption. They warned that the ash cloud could block sunlight for weeks or even months, leading to dramatic temperature drops and agricultural disasters. I spent most of that first afternoon taking inventory of our resources and trying to calculate how long we could sustain our small group if we needed to remain in the warehouse for an extended period. We had access to the entire warehouse inventory, which included thousands of pounds of canned goods, frozen foods, dry goods, and other supplies. Our refrigeration systems were running on backup power, which meant we could keep perishable items fresh for as long as our fuel lasted. The backup generator fuel was my biggest concern. According to my calculations, we had enough diesel fuel to run the generators for approximately 2 weeks if we used them continuously. After that, we would lose power, heating, and refrigeration. I made a note in my emergency notebook to start rationing generator use immediately, running the systems only when absolutely necessary. As evening approached, the temperature outside had dropped to 28 degrees, well below freezing. Inside the warehouse, we were comfortable thanks to the building's insulation and our heating system, but I knew we needed to start thinking about long-term heating solutions. The warehouse was designed to be energy efficient for storing food, not for housing people during a climate emergency. We set up sleeping areas in the break room and my office, using cardboard and packaging materials to create makeshift bedding. It was not comfortable, but it was warm and dry. That first night, as I listened to the wind howling outside and the continued reports on the emergency radio broadcasts, I began to understand that this was not a temporary crisis that would be resolved in a few days. The radio reports were becoming more dire with each passing hour. Cities across the northwestern United States were reporting complete communication blackouts. Transportation systems had shut down due to ash accumulation on roads and airports. The National Guard had been activated in multiple states, but their response was being hampered by the same conditions that were affecting everyone else. I tried calling my sister Elena, who was a student at the University of Colorado in Boulder, but the call would not go through. The cell phone networks were either overloaded or damaged by the ash. This worried me more than I wanted to admit. Elena was only 22 years old, and Boulder was about 40 miles northwest of Denver, much closer to the path of the initial ash cloud. She had been planning to call me that morning to discuss her plans for coming home for the weekend, but I had not heard from her since the eruption began. On the second day, Wednesday, October 16th, we woke up to discover that the temperature outside had dropped to 15 degrees. The ash was still falling, though not as heavily as the day before, and it had mixed with moisture in the air to create a gray, slushy mess that coated everything outside. The parking lot looked like an alien landscape, with cars buried under several inches of ash-snow mixture, and the surrounding buildings barely visible through the continued haze. The radio broadcasts brought more troubling news. Denver International Airport had been closed indefinitely due to ash accumulation on the runways. Interstate highways throughout Colorado were impassable. The mayor of Denver had declared a state of emergency and was asking residents to remain in their homes and conserve resources. Power outages were being reported throughout the metropolitan area as the weight of the ash brought down power lines and overloaded electrical systems. By midday Wednesday, our small group had been joined by 3 more people, a family of neighbors who lived near the warehouse and had walked through the ash to reach us. They brought with them reports of what was happening in the surrounding residential areas. Many homes had lost power, and people were struggling to stay warm as temperatures continued to drop. Some families were burning furniture and other materials to heat their homes, creating dangerous fire hazards and adding more smoke to the already polluted air. I realized that our warehouse was becoming a beacon of safety in an increasingly dangerous situation. We had power, heat, food, and water, which made us incredibly fortunate compared to most people in the area. But I also realized that this advantage came with significant responsibility. Every decision I made about resources, security, and admissions could mean the difference between life and death for the people depending on me. That second evening, as we gathered around a battery-powered radio to listen to the latest news, I heard something that chilled me more than the dropping temperatures outside. A scientist from the United States Geological Survey was explaining the potential long-term effects of the Yellowstone eruption. He estimated that ash clouds could continue affecting weather patterns for months, possibly years. Global temperatures could drop by several degrees, leading to crop failures and widespread famine. This was not a natural disaster that would be cleaned up in a few weeks. This was the beginning of a fundamental change in our world. The third day, Thursday, brought the most dramatic temperature drop yet. When I checked the outdoor thermometer that morning, it read -5 degrees Fahrenheit. In 3 days, the temperature had dropped nearly 60 degrees. The ash had largely stopped falling, but what was on the ground had frozen into a concrete-like layer that would be nearly impossible to remove. Denver looked like a city that had been abandoned for years rather than days. Our generator fuel consumption was higher than I had hoped due to the increased heating demands. I recalculated our fuel reserves and estimated that we now had perhaps 10 days of continuous generator operation remaining. This meant we needed to start making difficult decisions about rationing electricity and heat. I gathered our group together to explain the situation and to begin implementing conservation measures. We need to start thinking of ourselves as a small community rather than a group of people waiting for rescue, I told them. The information we are getting from the outside suggests that this situation is going to last much longer than any of us initially thought. We have advantages that many people do not have, but we need to use our resources wisely if we want to survive. I implemented a system for tracking our food consumption, water usage, and fuel reserves. Using my warehouse management experience, I created detailed inventories and consumption projections. If we were careful, we had enough food to last several months, but only if we maintained strict rationing. Water was less of a concern since our building's plumbing was still functional. But I was worried about what would happen if the municipal water system failed due to power outages or infrastructure damage. The radio broadcasts on Thursday brought news that made our situation feel even more precarious. Communications with several major cities in Wyoming and Montana had been completely lost. Scientists were reporting that the ash cloud had spread much further than initially predicted, affecting weather patterns as far south as New Mexico and as far east as Kansas. The term volcanic winter was now being used regularly, and comparisons were being made to historical climate disasters that had lasted for years. That third night, as I lay on my makeshift bed in the office, I thought about the notebook I had been keeping for the past 3 years. All of those calculations about emergency preparedness, all of those contingency plans I had developed for supply chain disruptions, had suddenly become the foundation for keeping real people alive in an unthinkable situation. I had never imagined that my obsession with planning and preparation would be tested in such a dramatic way. I also thought about Alina and wondered if she was safe somewhere in Boulder, or if she had managed to evacuate before the worst of the ash fall. The lack of communication was perhaps the most difficult part of the entire experience. Not knowing what was happening to people you cared about, not knowing if help was coming, not knowing how long the crisis would last. All we could do was make the best decisions we could with the information we had, and hope that our preparations would be enough. The fourth day brought another group of survivors to our door. A family of 5, including 3 small children, had walked nearly 2 miles through the frozen ash to reach our warehouse. They had heard from neighbors that we were providing shelter, and they were desperate for warmth and food. Their arrival brought our total population to 18 people, and it also brought home the reality that word was spreading about our facility. This presented both an opportunity and a problem. On one hand, I felt a moral obligation to help anyone who needed shelter and had the means to reach us safely. On the other hand, every additional person reduced our resources and shortened the time we could sustain ourselves. I knew that at some point, we would face the terrible decision of turning people away or risking the survival of everyone already in our group. As I looked at the 3 children, the youngest barely 2 years old, I knew that we could not turn them away. But I also knew that this decision would set a precedent for how we handled future arrivals. I gathered our core group together to discuss the situation and to establish some guidelines for admission and resource allocation. We need to be realistic about our capacity, I explained. We can support more people than we currently have, but there are limits. We also need to think about what happens if conditions get worse or if we are cut off from outside help for longer than we expect. Every person we admit is someone we are promising to keep alive, and that is not a promise we can make lightly. By the 5th day, Friday, October 20th, the temperature had stabilized at around -20 degrees, but the radio broadcasts suggested that this might be as warm as it would get for the foreseeable future. Reports from other parts of the country painted a picture of widespread infrastructure failure and social breakdown. The federal government was apparently coordinating relief efforts, but the scale of the disaster was overwhelming their capabilities. Our little community had developed routines and systems for managing daily life in the warehouse. We had established work schedules for maintaining our equipment, preparing meals, and monitoring our resources. People had taken on roles based on their skills and experience. Maria had become our unofficial coordinator for daily operations, while Carlos used his mechanical knowledge to maintain our generators and heating systems. I found myself spending most of my time on resource management and long-term planning. Every day, I updated my calculations about food consumption, fuel usage, and capacity limits. I also spent time listening to radio broadcasts and trying to piece together information about what was happening in the outside world. The picture that emerged was not encouraging. The 6th day brought news that Denver's municipal power grid had failed completely. We were now among the few buildings in the area with electricity and heat. This realization was both comforting and terrifying. It meant that our preparations and resources were even more valuable than we had realized. But it also meant that we were likely to attract more desperate people seeking shelter. That evening, as I worked on updating my resource calculations, I noticed that we were consuming food faster than I had projected. With 18 people, including 3 children who seemed to eat constantly, our carefully rationed supplies were disappearing more quickly than anticipated. I ran the numbers several times, hoping I had made an error, but the conclusion was unavoidable. At our current consumption rate, we would exhaust our food supplies in approximately 6 weeks. This calculation kept me awake most of the night. 6 weeks might be enough time for rescue operations to reach us, or for conditions to improve enough that we could venture out to find additional supplies. But it might not be enough. And if more people continued to arrive seeking shelter, our timeline would shrink even further. As I lay in the darkness, listening to the wind howling outside and the steady hum of our generators, I realized that the easy decisions were behind us. The next phase of our survival would require choices that no amount of warehouse management experience had prepared me for. We were about to discover what we were truly capable of when everything familiar and comfortable had been stripped away. The 7th day changed everything about how I understood leadership and survival. When I woke up that Saturday morning, October 21st, the temperature outside had remained at negative 20 degrees, but something felt different inside our warehouse community. People were no longer looking around with the confused expressions of temporary refugees. They were looking at me with the expectation of someone who had answers, someone who could guide them through an impossible situation. I had never wanted to be a leader in this sense. Managing a warehouse team was one thing. You had corporate policies, established procedures, and clear hierarchies. Everyone knew their job, and problems had solutions that could be found in employee handbooks or resolved with phone calls to headquarters. But corporate headquarters was probably dealing with their own survival issues now, and employee handbooks did not cover how to keep 18 people alive during a volcanic winter that might last for months or years. The reality of our situation had begun to sink in for everyone during that first week. The radio broadcasts were becoming less frequent, and when we did receive transmissions, the news was increasingly dire. Reports from other cities suggested that the ash cloud effects were far worse than initially predicted. Temperatures across the western United States had dropped to levels not seen since the last ice age. Agricultural areas were completely buried under ash, and scientists were beginning to use terms like mass starvation and societal collapse. Maria found me in my office that morning working on our latest resource calculations. "Javi, we need to talk about what happens when more people show up," she said, closing the door behind her. Yesterday, the Johnson family mentioned seeing other groups of people moving through the neighborhood. Some of them looked pretty desperate. We need to have a plan for how we handle requests for shelter. She was right, of course. During our first week, we had been able to accommodate new arrivals without seriously straining our resources, but we were approaching our practical capacity limits. The warehouse break room and my office could comfortably house maybe 25 people, but only if we converted more storage areas into living spaces. Every conversion meant giving up valuable storage for our supplies and making our heating systems work harder to warm larger areas. "I have been thinking about the same thing," I admitted, showing her my latest calculations. "Based on our current consumption rates and the people we have now, we can maintain everyone for about 6 weeks. If we add 5 more people, that drops to 5 weeks. If we add 10 more people, we are looking at maybe 4 weeks before we start facing serious shortages." The math was unforgiving, but it was also the only reliable guide we had for making decisions. I had learned during my years in warehouse management that emotions and good intentions could not change basic arithmetic. If we promised to keep people alive, we needed to have the resources to back up that promise, or we would end up failing everyone. That afternoon brought our first real test of these principles. A group of 7 people approached our loading dock, including 2 elderly women and a man who appeared to be suffering from hypothermia. They had been traveling for 2 days, trying to reach relatives in Denver, when their vehicle broke down about a mile from our warehouse. They had heard from other survivors that we were providing shelter, and they were begging us to let them in. I gathered our core group together for an emergency meeting, while the new arrivals waited in our loading dock area, which we had started using as a temporary holding area for people seeking admission. The loading dock was unheated, but it provided shelter from the wind and ash while we made decisions about longer-term accommodations. "If we take all 7 of them, we will have 25 people total," I explained to our group. "That puts us right at the edge of our space capacity, and it reduces our food timeline to about 4.5 weeks. But if we turn them away, they will probably die of exposure within hours." Carlos spoke up first. "We cannot just let people freeze to death outside our door. That man looked like he was already showing signs of severe hypothermia. If we have the space and the food, we have to help them." Others disagreed. Tom Bradley, one of our truck drivers who had been with us since the second day, argued that we needed to think about our own survival first. "I feel bad for those people, but we do not know how long this situation is going to last. What if rescue does not come for months? What if we need those resources to keep the people already here alive? This was the conversation I had been dreading since we first decided to offer shelter to others. Every person we admitted was a human being with family, hopes, and dreams. Every person we turned away was also a human being whose death we would have to live with. There were no clear ethical guidelines for making these kinds of decisions, and no one had trained me to weigh the lives of strangers against the survival of people I had already committed to protecting. I made the decision to admit all 7 new arrivals, but I also established our first formal admission policy. From that point forward, we would evaluate each request for shelter based on our current resource calculations and space availability. We would prioritize families with children, people with medical emergencies, and individuals who could contribute skills or resources to our community. It was not a perfect system, but it was better than making arbitrary decisions in the moment. The new arrivals brought our population to 25 people, and they also brought valuable information about conditions in other parts of Denver. According to their reports, most of the residential areas they had traveled through were completely abandoned. Houses stood empty with broken windows and doors left open, suggesting that people had evacuated quickly or had succumbed to the harsh conditions. They had encountered only a few other groups of survivors, and most of those groups were struggling with inadequate shelter and food supplies. One of the new arrivals, a woman named Patricia Williams who had worked as a nurse before the eruption, became an invaluable addition to our community. She immediately took charge of treating the hypothermia case and established basic medical protocols for monitoring everyone's health. Her medical knowledge helped us understand the physical challenges we were facing and gave us better ways to prevent cold-related injuries and illnesses. By the 8th day, Sunday, October 22nd, our community had developed more sophisticated systems for managing daily life. We had established meal schedules, work assignments, and sleeping arrangements that maximized our use of space and resources. People had naturally gravitated toward roles that matched their skills and experience. Patricia handled medical issues. Carlos and 2 other men maintained our mechanical systems, and Maria coordinated daily operations and resource distribution. I found myself spending most of my time on strategic planning and external monitoring. Every few hours, I would scan radio frequencies looking for news about rescue operations, weather forecasts, and reports from other survivor groups. I also maintained detailed logs of our resource consumption, population changes, and equipment status. These logs had become our most important tool for making informed decisions about our survival strategy. The radio broadcasts during the second week brought increasingly troubling news about the scope of the disaster. Scientists were now estimating that the volcanic winter could last anywhere from 6 months to several years, depending on how much ash remained in the atmosphere and whether secondary eruptions occurred. Agricultural production across North America had essentially stopped, and food shortages were being reported in areas that had not been directly affected by the ash fall. More disturbing were the reports about social breakdown in major population centers. Cities like Salt Lake City, Boise, and Cheyenne had apparently experienced complete infrastructure collapse, with widespread looting, violence, and mass migrations of desperate people seeking food and shelter. Federal and state authorities were struggling to maintain order, and military resources were being stretched thin trying to provide aid to millions of displaced persons. These reports made me realize that our warehouse was not just a temporary shelter, but potentially a long-term survival base. If government rescue operations were overwhelmed or delayed, we might need to sustain ourselves for months rather than weeks. This realization forced me to start thinking about our situation differently. Instead of planning for short-term survival until help arrived, I needed to start planning for long-term sustainability and self-sufficiency. On the 9th day, Monday, October 23rd, I made the decision that would define the next phase of our survival. We needed to begin expanding our resource base by venturing outside the warehouse to gather additional supplies. Our current food stores would last about 4 more weeks at our current consumption rate, but there were potential sources of additional supplies within a few miles of our location. I had been thinking about this possibility since the fourth day, when I first realized that our supplies might not last as long as we hoped. The industrial area around our warehouse included several other businesses that might have useful resources. A restaurant supply company, a hardware store, a medical supply distributor, and a gas station with an attached convenience store. If these businesses had been abandoned, their inventories could significantly extend our survival timeline. The challenge was that venturing outside our warehouse involved serious risks. The temperature was still negative 20 degrees. Visibility was limited due to lingering ash in the air, and we had no way of knowing what other groups of survivors might be operating in the area. Some of the radio reports had mentioned conflicts between survivor groups over resources, and we needed to be prepared for the possibility that not all survivors would be friendly or cooperative. I spent most of that ninth day planning our first supply expedition. Using my knowledge of the local business district and input from employees who were familiar with the area, I identified the most promising targets and planned safe routes between them. I also established protocols for the expedition team, including communication schedules, emergency procedures, and resource priorities. The planning process revealed how much our situation had changed our thinking about normal social rules and legal boundaries. Under normal circumstances, taking supplies from abandoned businesses would be considered theft or looting. But in our current situation, those supplies might mean the difference between life and death for 25 people. We were operating in a world where traditional legal and ethical frameworks no longer applied, and we had to develop new principles based on survival necessity and collective welfare. Carlos volunteered to lead the supply expedition, along with 2 other men who had military or outdoors experience. I wanted to go myself, but the group convinced me that I was too valuable to risk on the first expedition. If something happened to me, they argued, the entire community would lose its primary decision maker and resource coordinator. This was difficult for me to accept because I felt responsible for every aspect of our survival, but I recognized that they were probably right. The 10th day, Tuesday, October 24th, brought our most difficult admission decision yet. A group of 12 people arrived at our loading dock, including 6 adults and 6 children ranging in age from infant to teenager. They had been traveling for 4 days from a suburb north of Denver, and they were in desperate condition. Several of the adults showed signs of severe cold exposure, and the children were clearly malnourished and frightened. Adding 12 more people to our community would bring our total population to 37, well beyond our planned capacity, and pushing our food supplies to a critical level. By my calculations, supporting 37 people would reduce our food timeline to less than 3 weeks, even if our supply expedition was successful. But turning away 6 children, including an infant, was unthinkable for most of our community members. The debate over this admission request lasted several hours and revealed deep divisions within our group about our priorities and obligations. Some people argued that we had a moral duty to help anyone we could, especially children, regardless of the impact on our resources. Others contended that we had a responsibility to the people already in our community, and that taking on more people than we could support would ultimately result in everyone dying. Patricia, our nurse, examined the new arrivals and reported that 2 of the adults required immediate medical attention for hypothermia and malnutrition. One of the children, a 7-year-old girl, had developed what appeared to be the early stages of pneumonia. Without treatment and proper shelter, she would probably not survive another night in the harsh conditions outside. I found myself in the impossible position of making a decision that would affect the lives of 17 different people, including 6 children who had no control over their situation. There was no right answer, no clear ethical principle that could guide this choice. Whatever I decided, people might die as a result. In the end, I chose to admit the entire group, but I also announced that we were now at our absolute capacity limit. Any future requests for admission would have to be evaluated against the possibility of turning away current community members to make room. It was a harsh policy, but it was the only way I could see to balance our moral obligations with the mathematical realities of our resource constraints. The new arrivals brought valuable skills and information to our community. One of the adults, a man named Robert Kim, had been an engineer before the eruption and had extensive knowledge of heating systems and power generation. Another, Lisa Martinez, had worked in food service management and understood large-scale meal planning and nutrition. But they also brought sobering reports about conditions in the areas they had traveled through. According to their accounts, most of the residential areas north of Denver were completely abandoned. They had seen numerous houses that had been damaged by the weight of accumulated ash, and many neighborhoods showed signs of recent fires. They had encountered very few other survivors, and those they did meet were generally hostile and suspicious. Resources were scarce everywhere, and trust between strangers had largely broken down. On the 11th day, Wednesday, October 25th, Carlos and his team prepared for our first supply expedition. They would target the restaurant supply company first, since it was closest to our warehouse and most likely to contain the types of food and supplies we needed. If that expedition was successful, they would plan additional trips to other businesses in the area. I spent the morning going over the expedition plan with Carlos and making sure he understood our resource priorities. Canned goods and other non-perishable foods were the highest priority, followed by medical supplies, fuel for our generators, and materials that could be used to improve our heating and shelter systems. They would also look for any communications equipment that might help us establish contact with other survivor groups or rescue organizations. The expedition team consisted of Carlos, Tom Bradley, our truck driver, and Robert Kim, our new engineer. They were equipped with cold weather gear that we had improvised from warehouse materials, walkie-talkies for communication with the warehouse, and improvised weapons for self-defense. They planned to be gone for no more than 4 hours, which would give them enough time to reach the restaurant supply company, evaluate the situation, and return before dark. As I watched them prepare to leave through our loading dock, I realized how much our situation had changed since that first Tuesday morning 12 days earlier. We were no longer warehouse employees waiting for normal operations to resume. We had become a survival community with our own rules, priorities, and risks. The decisions I made now affected not just inventory and delivery schedules, but the lives of 37 people who depended on our collective resources and planning. The radio broadcasts that morning included the first reports we had heard about organized rescue operations in our area. Military units were apparently establishing refugee centers at several locations around Denver, including one at the Denver Federal Center, about 15 miles southwest of our warehouse. However, the reports also indicated that these centers were overwhelmed and undersupplied, with long waiting lists for admission and inadequate resources for the numbers of people seeking help. This news created a new dilemma for our community. Should we attempt to make contact with the military rescue operations, or should we continue trying to survive independently? The rescue centers offered the possibility of professional medical care, better communications with the outside world, and potential evacuation to safer areas. But they also meant giving up control over our resources and decision-making, and possibly being separated from the community we had built. I decided to wait until Carlos returned from the supply expedition before making any decisions about contacting the rescue operations. If the expedition was successful and we could secure additional resources, we might be better off remaining independent. If the expedition failed or revealed that local resources were exhausted, we might need to consider the rescue centers as our best option for long-term survival. The afternoon of the 11th day was one of the longest of my life. Every hour that passed without word from the expedition team increased my anxiety about their safety and the success of their mission. I maintained regular radio contact with them, but their reports were brief and focused on their immediate situation rather than what they were finding at their target locations. As evening approached and the team had not yet returned, I began to worry that something had gone wrong. The temperature outside had dropped to -25 degrees, the coldest we had experienced yet. If their transportation had failed, or if they had encountered hostile survivors, they might not be able to make it back to the warehouse before hypothermia became a serious threat. Just after 7 o'clock that evening, I heard the sound of our loading dock door opening and the voices of the expedition team. Carlos and his team had returned safely, and they had brought back enough supplies to extend our food timeline by at least 2 weeks. More importantly, they had gathered valuable intelligence about the condition of other businesses in the area and the presence of other survivor groups. The restaurant supply company had been largely intact and unlooted, containing substantial quantities of canned goods, frozen foods, and restaurant equipment. The building's heating system had failed, so the frozen foods were naturally preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. Carlos estimated that we could make several more trips to that location before exhausting its useful resources. However, the expedition team had also encountered signs of other survivor groups operating in the area. They had seen footprints and vehicle tracks around several businesses, and they had observed smoke from fires in 2 different locations. Some of these groups might be friendly and potentially cooperative, but others might view our well-supplied warehouse as a target for raids or takeover attempts. This intelligence forced me to start thinking about security measures for our warehouse. Until now, we had focused primarily on managing our internal resources and accommodating new arrivals. But if there were potentially hostile groups in the area, we needed to start thinking about how to defend our community and our supplies from external threats. As I updated my planning notebooks that evening, incorporating the new information from the expedition and revising our resource calculations based on the additional supplies, I realized that we had crossed another threshold in our survival journey. We were no longer just trying to wait out a temporary crisis. We were building the foundation for a new kind of community, one that could sustain itself independently for months or possibly years in a world that had fundamentally changed. The success of our first supply expedition gave me hope that we could continue to extend our survival timeline through careful planning and calculated risks. But it also made me aware of new challenges and threats that we had not previously considered. Our warehouse community was growing stronger and more self-sufficient, but we were also becoming more visible to other survivors who might not share our cooperative approach to survival. The 12th day marked the beginning of what I now think of as our most dangerous period. The success of Carlos's expedition had given everyone a sense of hope and confidence, but it had also revealed just how precarious our situation really was. While we had managed to extend our food supplies by 2 weeks, we had also learned that we were not alone in this frozen wasteland, and not all of the other survivors we might encounter would be friendly. I spent most of that Thursday morning, October 26th, planning our security arrangements and thinking about how to protect 37 people in a building that had never been designed as a fortress. Our warehouse had multiple entry points including 4 loading dock doors, 2 pedestrian entrances, and several emergency exits. During normal operations, this accessibility had been an advantage for efficient cargo movement. Now it represented multiple vulnerabilities that could be exploited by anyone who wanted to take our resources by force. Robert Kim, our new engineer, proved invaluable in developing security improvements. He suggested ways to reinforce our doors using materials from the warehouse, and he designed early warning systems using motion sensors from our inventory management equipment. We also established watch schedules so that someone would always be monitoring our perimeter, especially during the night hours when an attack would be most likely to occur. The radio broadcasts that morning brought news that made our security concerns feel even more urgent. Reports from other parts of Colorado described increasing conflicts between survivor groups as resources became scarcer. A refugee center in Colorado Springs had apparently been overrun by desperate survivors, resulting in several deaths and the loss of substantial supplies. Military authorities were warning about the breakdown of civil order and advising established survivor communities to be prepared to defend themselves. These reports made me realize that our warehouse's advantages could also make us a target. We had electricity, heat, food, and medical supplies at a time when most people had none of these things. Word about our community was probably spreading among other survivors, and eventually someone might decide that taking our resources was easier than trying to find their own. I called a community meeting that afternoon to discuss our security situation and to establish protocols for dealing with potential threats. This was a difficult conversation because many of our people had never considered the possibility that other survivors might pose a danger to us. We had all grown up in a society where law enforcement and military protection were taken for granted. Now, we had to accept that we were responsible for our own defense. We need to understand that the normal rules of society are not functioning right now, I explained to the group. The police are not coming if we call for help. The military is overwhelmed with their own priorities. If someone decides they want what we have, we are going to have to protect ourselves. Some people were uncomfortable with this reality, especially the idea that we might need to use force to defend our community. Patricia, our nurse, argued that we should focus on cooperation and sharing rather than preparation for conflict. There has to be enough resources for everyone if we work together, she said. Violence is only going to make everything worse. I understood her perspective, and part of me agreed with it. But I also knew that good intentions and moral principles would not protect us from people who were desperate enough to kill for food and shelter. We had already seen evidence that not all survivor groups were operating according to cooperative principles, and we needed to be prepared for the possibility that negotiation and sharing would not be options. Carlos supported the security preparations based on what his expedition team had observed during their supply run. There are definitely other groups out there, and some of them have been moving around at night, he reported. We saw fresh vehicle tracks and evidence of recent campfires, but we never actually encountered anyone. That could mean they are avoiding contact on purpose, which might not be a good sign. We established security protocols that included password systems for identifying community members, procedures for responding to requests for admission, and plans for defending our warehouse if we came under attack. We also created secure storage areas for our most critical supplies, including medical equipment, communications gear, and emergency food reserves that could sustain a small group if the main warehouse was compromised. The 13th day, Friday, October 27th, brought our first direct encounter with other survivors who were not seeking to join our community. Carlos was leading our second supply expedition to a hardware store about 3 miles from our warehouse when his team encountered a group of 8 people who were also scavenging for resources. The encounter was tense but not violent, with both groups maintaining their distance and avoiding direct confrontation. According to Carlos's report, the other group appeared to be better armed than our expedition team, with what looked like hunting rifles and military-style equipment. They had been systematically looting businesses in the area and had established what appeared to be a temporary camp in an abandoned auto repair shop. When Carlos tried to initiate communication, their leader made it clear that they considered the entire business district to be their territory and that our presence was not welcome. This encounter forced us to reconsider our supply expedition strategy. We could not afford to get into armed conflicts with other survivor groups, but we also could not allow ourselves to be driven away from resources that we needed for our survival. I decided that future expeditions would need to be larger and better prepared for potential confrontations, even if we hoped to avoid violence. The hardware store expedition was only partially successful due to the territorial claims of the other group. Carlos's team managed to gather some useful materials, including tools, hardware supplies, and propane tanks for heating. But they had to abandon several planned objectives when it became clear that the other group was monitoring their activities and might intervene if they stayed too long. More troubling was Carlos's assessment that the other group was probably planning to expand their territorial control to include more of the surrounding business district. If they decided that our warehouse was within their claimed territory, we might face demands to surrender our supplies or leave the area entirely. Given our investment in the warehouse and the difficulty of relocating 37 people in sub-zero conditions, neither option was realistic. I spent that evening working on contingency plans for dealing with territorial conflicts and resource competition. The mathematics of survival were becoming more complex, as we had to account not just for our own consumption and supply acquisition, but also for the possibility that other groups might interfere with our access to resources or directly threaten our community. The 14th day brought the crisis I had been dreading since Carlos's encounter with the territorial group. Saturday morning, October 28th, I was awakened at dawn by Tom Bradley, who was on perimeter watch duty. "Javi, you need to see this," he said urgently. "There are people outside, and they do not look like they are asking for help." Through the small windows in my office, I could see a group of 6 people positioned around our warehouse. They were maintaining their distance, but they were clearly conducting some kind of surveillance or reconnaissance of our facility. Several of them appeared to be armed, and their behavior suggested military or law enforcement training. This was not a group of desperate refugees seeking shelter. This was a group that was evaluating our warehouse as a potential target. I immediately activated our security protocols, alerting all community members to remain away from windows and to prepare for a possible confrontation. I also attempted to establish radio communication with the group outside, using a portable radio on emergency frequencies. After several attempts, I received a response from someone who identified himself as the leader of what he called a resource recovery team. The conversation that followed was one of the most difficult of my entire life. The group's leader, who called himself Captain Morrison, claimed that our warehouse contained supplies that rightfully belonged to the broader survivor community in the Denver area. He argued that hoarding resources while other people were dying was morally unacceptable, and he demanded that we turn over 75% of our food supplies and open our facility to his group. "You have 37 people living in luxury while hundreds of others are freezing and starving," Morrison said over the radio. "That is not sustainable, and it is not fair. We are prepared to take those supplies with or without your cooperation, but we would prefer to handle this peacefully." I tried to explain that our supplies were not unlimited and that we had worked hard to gather them through careful planning and dangerous expeditions. I also pointed out that we had been accepting refugees and sharing our resources with anyone who could reach us safely. But Morrison was not interested in negotiation or compromise. He wanted immediate compliance with his demands, or he was prepared to take our resources by force. The standoff continued for most of the morning, with Morrison's group maintaining their positions around our warehouse while I tried to develop a response strategy. Our security preparations gave us some advantages in terms of defensive positions and early warning systems, but we were clearly outgunned and outmanned if the situation escalated to violence. I called an emergency community meeting to discuss our options. We could surrender the demanded supplies and hope that Morrison's group would leave us alone afterward. We could attempt to negotiate a smaller tribute or some kind of cooperative arrangement. Or we could refuse their demands and prepare to defend our warehouse, knowing that people might be killed in the resulting conflict. The community was deeply divided about how to respond. Some people, led by Patricia, argued that we should give Morrison's group what they wanted to avoid bloodshed. "No supplies are worth risking lives," she said. "We can find more food, but we cannot bring back people who die in a fight." Others, including Carlos and Robert, argued that surrendering to Morrison's demands would only encourage other groups to make similar demands. "If we give in now, every armed group in the area will know that we can be intimidated," Carlos pointed out. "We will end up losing everything anyway, just a little bit at a time." I found myself in the impossible position of making a decision that could result in people dying regardless of what I chose. If we fought and lost, our people would be killed or driven out into the freezing conditions. If we surrendered our supplies, we might not have enough resources to survive until rescue operations could reach us. There was no choice that guaranteed everyone's safety. After several hours of debate, I made the decision that would haunt me for weeks afterward. We would refuse Morrison's demands, but we would also attempt to avoid direct confrontation by offering him a much smaller contribution of supplies in exchange for safe passage through the area for our expedition teams. It was a compromise that satisfied no one completely, but it seemed like the least dangerous option available. Morrison rejected our counteroffer immediately. "You have 1 hour to comply with our original demands, or we will take what we need by force," he radioed back. "This is not a negotiation. This is notice of our intentions." The next hour was the longest 60 minutes of my life. I coordinated our defensive preparations while hoping desperately that Morrison was bluffing about his willingness to attack. We positioned people at strategic points throughout the warehouse, established communication protocols, and prepared our improvised weapons. Most of our people had never been in a violent confrontation, and I could see the fear and uncertainty on their faces. Robert Kim surprised everyone by revealing that he had military experience from his service in the National Guard several years earlier. He took charge of organizing our defensive positions and explaining basic tactics to people who had never thought about such things. "The most important thing is to avoid panic," he told the group. "Stay calm, follow instructions, and remember that we have significant advantages in terms of position and knowledge of this building." As the deadline approached, I made one final attempt to contact Morrison on the radio. I offered to provide him with information about other resource locations in the area, hoping that we could redirect his attention to targets that did not involve attacking our community. But Morrison was not interested in alternatives. He wanted our specific supplies, and he was prepared to take them by force. At exactly 1 hour after his ultimatum, Morrison's group began their attack on our warehouse. They did not attempt a direct assault on our main entrances, which were well defended and reinforced. Instead, they tried to create multiple breaches simultaneously, using tools to damage our loading dock doors and attempting to cut through the fence around our facility. The attack lasted approximately 45 minutes and was unlike anything I had ever experienced. The fear, confusion, and adrenaline of combat were overwhelming, but I forced myself to focus on coordinating our response and making tactical decisions. Robert's military experience proved invaluable in directing our defense, and our knowledge of the warehouse layout gave us significant advantages. We managed to repel the attack without anyone in our community being seriously injured, though 2 people suffered minor cuts and bruises during the fighting. Morrison's group withdrew after failing to breach our defenses, but not before threatening to return with reinforcements and more sophisticated equipment. The aftermath of the attack left our entire community shaken and traumatized. Several people were questioning whether our warehouse was safe enough to remain our long-term base, and others were wondering if we should have surrendered the supplies to avoid the violence. I found myself second-guessing every decision I had made, wondering if there had been better options that I had failed to consider. But we had also learned important lessons about our defensive capabilities and our ability to work together under extreme pressure. Morrison's group had been better armed and more experienced, but we had successfully protected our community and our resources. More importantly, we had demonstrated to ourselves and to other potential threats that we were not easy targets who would surrender at the first sign of trouble. The radio broadcasts that evening included reports of similar conflicts throughout the Denver area. Military authorities were acknowledging that they could not provide protection to all survivor communities, and they were advising groups like ours to establish cooperative relationships with neighboring survivors for mutual defense. The breakdown of civil order was becoming more widespread, and violence between survivor groups was increasing as resources became scarcer. I spent most of that night updating our security protocols and planning improvements to our defensive capabilities. The attack had revealed weaknesses in our perimeter security that needed to be addressed before Morrison or other groups attempted another assault. We also needed to establish better communication with other friendly survivor communities in the area, both for mutual support and for early warning about potential threats. As I worked on these plans, I realized that our warehouse community had crossed another important threshold. We were no longer just trying to survive until rescue arrived. We were establishing ourselves as a permanent presence in a new and dangerous world, one where strength and preparation were the primary determinants of survival. The comfortable assumptions of our previous lives had been completely swept away, and we were building something entirely new from the fundamental requirements of staying alive in impossible conditions. The experience of defending our community had also changed how I thought about leadership and responsibility. Managing inventory and coordinating deliveries had prepared me for some aspects of resource management and planning, but nothing had prepared me for making decisions that could result in people dying. I was no longer just a warehouse manager who happened to be helping people through a crisis. I had become the leader of a survival community that might need to fight for its existence against other groups of desperate human beings. The aftermath of Morrison's attack marked the beginning of our darkest period, though we did not realize it at the time. Sunday, October 29th, dawned with temperatures that had dropped to -30 degrees, the coldest we had experienced since the eruption began 2 weeks earlier. The extreme cold was more than just uncomfortable. It was becoming a direct threat to our survival systems and our ability to maintain the warehouse as a viable shelter. I discovered the first serious problem when I checked our generator fuel levels that morning. The attack had forced us to run our backup systems at maximum capacity for nearly 6 hours, consuming far more diesel fuel than I had calculated in our emergency protocols. Combined with the increased heating demands from the extreme cold, we had burned through almost 3 days' worth of fuel reserves in a single day. My revised calculations showed that we now had perhaps 8 days of continuous generator operation remaining, instead of the 12 days I had projected just 48 hours earlier. This fuel crisis was compounded by damage to our heating distribution system that had occurred during the attack. Morrison's group had managed to damage several external ventilation units before we repelled them, and the sub-zero temperatures had caused additional problems with pipes and heating ducts. Robert Kim estimated that our heating efficiency had been reduced by at least 20%, meaning we would need to burn even more fuel to maintain habitable temperatures inside the warehouse. The mathematics of our situation were becoming impossible to ignore. With 37 people to keep warm and fed, reduced heating efficiency, and limited fuel reserves, we were facing a crisis that threatened the survival of our entire community. Even if we could solve the heating problems, our food supplies were being consumed faster than anticipated due to the stress and increased caloric needs of people living in extreme cold conditions. I called a community meeting that morning to explain our resource situation and to discuss the difficult decisions we would need to make in the coming days. This was perhaps the hardest conversation I had ever had with our group, because I had to tell people who had trusted me with their lives that our carefully managed survival plan was failing. We have enough food for approximately 3 more weeks at our current consumption rate, I began, showing them the calculations I had been working on throughout the night. Our heating fuel will last 8 days if we maintain current usage, or possibly 12 days if we implement severe conservation measures. The damage from yesterday's attack has made our heating system less efficient, and the extreme cold is increasing our fuel consumption beyond what we planned for. The silence that followed this announcement was profound and terrifying. These were people who had already given up everything they owned, lost contact with their families, and endured 2 weeks of unimaginable hardship. Now they were learning that even our refuge might not be sustainable much longer. Patricia was the first to speak. "What are our options?" she asked quietly. "Do we try to contact those military rescue centers? Do we attempt to relocate to a different facility? Or do we just hope that conditions improve before we run out of resources?" These were exactly the questions I had been struggling with since discovering the extent of our fuel crisis. Each option involved serious risks and potential consequences. The military rescue centers might provide better long-term security, but they were overcrowded and undersupplied according to the radio reports. Relocating our entire community in sub-zero conditions would be extremely dangerous, especially for the children and elderly members of our group. And simply hoping for improvement was not a strategy that would keep 37 people alive. Carlos suggested that we attempt another major supply expedition to look for additional fuel sources and heating equipment. There are several gas stations and heating supply companies within a few miles of here, he pointed out. If we can organize a larger expedition with better equipment, we might be able to gather enough resources to extend our timeline significantly. Robert disagreed with this approach based on his assessment of the security situation. "Morrison's group is still out there, and they probably have friends," he argued. "Any major expedition we send out is going to be vulnerable to attack, and we cannot afford to lose people or equipment right now. We need to focus on conservation and finding ways to improve our efficiency with the resources we already have." The debate continued for several hours, with different factions of our community supporting different approaches to our crisis. Some people wanted to take aggressive action to secure more resources, while others preferred defensive strategies focused on conservation and sustainability. A few individuals quietly suggested that we should consider splitting up the group, allowing smaller groups to have better survival chances than trying to sustain everyone together. This last suggestion was particularly painful because it forced us to confront the possibility that our community, which had become like a family over the past 2 weeks, might not be sustainable in its current form. We had invested so much emotional energy in building relationships and cooperative systems that the idea of breaking apart felt like admitting complete failure. I postponed making any final decisions about our strategy until I could gather more information about our options and the external conditions we would face. That afternoon, I spent several hours monitoring radio frequencies and trying to establish contact with other survivor groups or military authorities who might provide guidance about rescue operations or resource availability. The radio communications I intercepted that day painted a grim picture of conditions throughout the Denver metropolitan area. Several established survivor communities had apparently collapsed due to resource shortages or conflicts with other groups. The military rescue centers were reporting that they were at capacity and could not accept new refugees for at least 2 weeks. Most disturbing were reports of increasing violence and territorial conflicts as survivor groups competed for dwindling resources. One radio transmission that particularly concerned me was a conversation between two groups that seemed to be coordinating some kind of joint operation in our general area. They mentioned plans to consolidate resources from smaller communities and referred to our business district by name. While I could not determine their exact intentions, the tone of their communications suggested that they might be planning operations similar to Morrison's attack, but with larger forces and better coordination. That evening brought the first signs of serious medical problems within our community. Patricia reported that 3 people were showing symptoms of malnutrition and cold-related illnesses that required immediate attention. The combination of reduced food rations, extreme stress, and sub-zero temperatures was beginning to take a toll on people's health, especially among the children and elderly members of our group. 7-year-old Sofia Rivera, Carlos's daughter, had developed a persistent cough that Patricia feared might be developing into pneumonia. An elderly man named Frank Wilson was showing signs of hypothermia despite our best efforts to keep the warehouse warm. Most concerning was Lisa Martinez, who had been managing our food preparation and was now exhibiting symptoms of severe depression and anxiety that were affecting her ability to function. These medical problems forced me to realize that our timeline for making critical decisions was even shorter than our resource calculations suggested. People could not survive indefinitely under the stress and privation we were experiencing, even if we had adequate food and fuel. The psychological and physical toll of our situation was accumulating, and we needed solutions that addressed human needs beyond just calories and warmth. Monday, October 30th, brought the decision that would define the next phase of our survival. I had spent most of the night working on different scenarios and resource calculations, trying to find a path forward that offered hope for our community's survival. Every option involved serious risks, but one approach seemed to offer the best combination of immediate relief and long-term sustainability. I proposed that we organize our largest and most ambitious supply expedition yet, targeting multiple locations simultaneously to gather the resources we needed for extended survival. Rather than sending small teams to individual businesses, we would commit most of our able-bodied adults to a coordinated operation that could secure significant quantities of fuel, food, and equipment in a single day. The plan was risky because it would leave our warehouse defended by only a few people, making us vulnerable to attack while our main force was away. But it also offered the possibility of gathering enough resources to extend our survival timeline by several weeks, potentially long enough for rescue operations to reach us, or for conditions to improve enough that we could consider relocation options. Carlos supported the expedition plan, but he insisted that we needed better intelligence about other groups in the area before committing so many people to operations outside our warehouse. We need to know where Morrison's group is based and what kind of resources they have, he argued. We also need to understand if there are other groups operating in the area that might interfere with our operations. This intelligence requirement led to our first dedicated reconnaissance mission. Tom Bradley, who had the most experience with the local area, volunteered to conduct a solo scouting mission to gather information about other survivor groups and potential resource locations. It was extremely dangerous work, but the information he could provide was essential for planning our larger expedition. Tom left the warehouse before dawn on Tuesday, October 31st, equipped with cold weather gear, emergency supplies, and a radio for maintaining contact with our base. His mission was to observe the locations where we had seen evidence of other groups, to identify new potential resource targets, and to assess the general security situation in our area. While Tom was conducting his reconnaissance, I worked with Robert and Carlos to develop detailed plans for our major supply expedition. We identified 6 target locations that could provide the mix of resources we needed: 2 gas stations for fuel, a medical supply distributor for pharmaceuticals and equipment, a restaurant supply warehouse for food, a hardware store for tools and materials, and a camping supply store for cold weather gear and portable heating equipment. The expedition would require careful timing and coordination to hit all 6 locations efficiently, while minimizing exposure to potential threats. We would use multiple vehicles to transport equipment and supplies, and we would maintain radio contact between all teams to coordinate movements and respond to emergencies. Tom returned from his reconnaissance mission that afternoon with intelligence that was both encouraging and deeply troubling. He had located Morrison's group at an abandoned truck stop about 5 miles from our warehouse, where they appeared to have established a permanent base with defensive positions and multiple vehicles. More concerning, he had observed evidence of at least 2 other organized groups operating in our area, including one that appeared to have military-style equipment and training. However, Tom had also identified several resource locations that appeared to be unguarded and relatively intact. The medical supply distributor in particular looked promising, with what appeared to be substantial inventories still stored in the building. He had also observed that most of the other groups seemed to be focused on residential areas rather than commercial districts, which might give us better access to business-related resources. Based on Tom's intelligence, I made the final decision to proceed with our major supply expedition on Wednesday, November 1st. We would commit 22 people to the operation, leaving 15 people to defend the warehouse, including Patricia and the medical cases that could not be moved safely. It was a calculated risk that could either solve our resource crisis or result in disaster for our entire community. The night before the expedition, I spent several hours talking individually with community members about their concerns and fears regarding our plan. Many people were terrified of leaving the relative safety of the warehouse, but they also understood that staying might mean slowly starving or freezing to death over the following weeks. Sofia Rivera's condition had worsened despite Patricia's treatment, and she now required constant monitoring for signs of pneumonia. Frank Wilson was showing increasing signs of hypothermia-related confusion, and Lisa Martinez had become almost completely non-functional due to depression and anxiety. These medical cases made it clear that our current situation was not sustainable even in the short term. Wednesday morning arrived with temperatures at -35 degrees, the coldest conditions we had experienced since the eruption began. The extreme cold would make our expedition more dangerous, but it would also preserve any frozen food supplies we might find and reduce the likelihood that other groups would be conducting operations in the same areas. As I prepared our expedition teams for departure, I realized that this operation would determine the future of our warehouse community. If we succeeded in gathering substantial resources, we could potentially survive for several more weeks and maybe establish contact with rescue operations. If we failed, or if we lost people during the expedition, our community might not have enough strength or resources to attempt another major operation. The 22 people who prepared to leave that morning represented nearly 2/3 of our total population. They included our most experienced and capable members, but they also included people who had never been outside the warehouse since arriving weeks earlier. Some of them might not survive the day, and I would be responsible for whatever happened to them. Carlos would lead the largest team targeting the restaurant supply warehouse and the camping supply store. Robert would take a smaller team to the medical supply distributor and one of the gas stations. Tom would lead the third team to the hardware store and the second gas station. I would coordinate all 3 teams from our warehouse base, maintaining radio contact and directing operations based on what each team encountered in the field. As I watched our 3 expedition teams drive away from the warehouse in vehicles we had modified for cold weather operations, I felt the weight of responsibility more heavily than at any point since this crisis began. The next 8 hours would determine whether our warehouse community survived to face whatever challenges lay ahead, or whether we would join the growing number of survivor groups that had collapsed under the pressure of impossible circumstances. The radio remained quiet for the first hour after the teams departed, which was according to plan. They were maintaining radio silence to avoid attracting attention from other groups who might be monitoring communications frequencies. But as the minutes passed, I found myself watching the clock obsessively, calculating travel times and wondering whether the silence meant that everything was going according to plan or that something had gone terribly wrong. The The radio silence lasted exactly 93 minutes before Carlos's voice crackled through our communications system, with the words I had been both hoping for and dreading. Base, this is Team 1. We have encountered other survivors at the restaurant supply warehouse. They appear to be friendly, but they are requesting immediate assistance. We need guidance on how to proceed. This was the moment that would define not just our supply expedition, but the entire future of our warehouse community. Carlos's team had found other survivors, but the request for assistance meant that our carefully planned resource-gathering operation was about to become something much more complicated. Every decision I made in the next few minutes could determine whether we returned to our warehouse with the supplies we desperately needed, or whether we found ourselves committed to helping strangers when we barely had enough resources to sustain our own people. Carlos, what is the nature of their situation and how many people are we talking about? I radioed back, trying to gather the information I needed to make an informed decision. The silence that followed lasted long enough for me to imagine a dozen different scenarios, none of them simple. Base, we have approximately 15 people here, including several children and 2 adults who appear to be suffering from severe hypothermia, Carlos finally responded. They have been sheltering in the warehouse office area for the past week, but they have no heating source and very limited food supplies. Their leader is asking if we can provide immediate medical assistance and possibly transportation to a warmer location. I found myself facing exactly the kind of impossible choice that had defined our survival journey since the eruption began 17 days earlier. These 15 people were in immediate danger and would probably die within hours if they did not receive help. But committing our expedition team to a rescue operation would consume time, resources, and transportation capacity that we had allocated for gathering the supplies our own community needed to survive. Patricia, who was monitoring our radio communications from the warehouse, immediately volunteered her medical opinion. Javi, if they have severe hypothermia cases, those people need treatment within the next few hours or they will die. We cannot just leave them there, especially if there are children involved. But Robert, who was leading Team 2 at the medical supply distributor, offered a different perspective when I contacted him for input. Base, we need to remember that we have our own medical cases back at the warehouse who also need treatment. If we split our resources trying to help everyone we encounter, we might end up losing people from both groups. The decision I made next was based on a calculation that went beyond simple resource management or even basic humanitarian concerns. Over the past 17 days, I had learned that survival in our new world required building alliances and relationships with other groups. A community of 15 people represented potential knowledge, skills, and manpower that could benefit our long-term survival if we could find a way to integrate them with our existing group. Carlos, tell their leader that we will provide immediate medical assistance and transportation back to our facility for anyone who needs it, I radioed. But make it clear that our resources are limited and that we will need to discuss long-term arrangements once we address the immediate medical crisis. This decision to rescue the 15 survivors at the restaurant supply warehouse fundamentally changed the scope and complexity of our supply expedition. Carlos's team spent the next 3 hours providing emergency medical treatment and organizing transportation for the most critically injured members of the new group. Meanwhile, Robert's and Tom's teams continued their resource-gathering operations at the other target locations, but with reduced timeframes due to the additional responsibilities we had assumed. The new group of survivors brought valuable intelligence about conditions in other parts of the Denver area, but they also brought sobering reports about the collapse of several other established communities. According to their leader, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, who had been an emergency room physician before the eruption, at least 6 organized survivor groups in the area had dissolved over the past week due to resource shortages, internal conflicts, or attacks by hostile groups. Dr. Chen's medical expertise proved immediately valuable when Carlos brought the most severely hypothermic survivors back to our warehouse. Working with Patricia, she was able to stabilize two adult patients who might not have survived another night in the unheated restaurant supply warehouse. But her presence also highlighted the inadequacy of our medical supplies and equipment for treating serious cold-related injuries and illnesses. By early afternoon, our three expedition teams had successfully completed their resource-gathering operations and were preparing to return to the warehouse. The results exceeded my most optimistic projections. Robert's team had secured enough medical supplies to treat our current patients and establish a basic clinic for future medical needs. Tom's team had gathered substantial quantities of heating fuel and equipment that could extend our generator operations for at least 3 more weeks. Carlos's team had collected enough food supplies to feed our expanded community for approximately 6 weeks, even accounting for the 15 new arrivals. However, the success of our expedition came with the immediate challenge of integrating 15 new community members into a facility that had already been operating at maximum capacity with 37 people. Dr. Chen's group included valuable additions like a mechanical engineer, a former police officer, and 2 people with agricultural experience. But they also included 3 elderly individuals and 4 children who would require significant resources and care. The logistics of housing 52 people in our warehouse pushed our improvised living arrangements beyond their practical limits. We needed to convert additional storage areas into sleeping quarters, establish new sanitation facilities, and reorganize our food preparation and distribution systems to handle nearly 50% more people than we had planned for. More critically, the addition of 15 new community members changed the fundamental dynamics of our decision-making processes and resource allocation policies. Dr. Chen's group had their own ideas about survival strategies and community organization, some of which conflicted with the systems we had developed over the past 17 days. The afternoon of November 1st brought our first serious internal conflict since forming our warehouse community. During a meeting to discuss resource allocation and sleeping arrangements for the new arrivals, several members of Dr. Chen's group questioned our security protocols and suggested that we should be more aggressive in securing resources from other locations in the area. "You have been too conservative in your approach to resource gathering," argued Marcus Webb, the former police officer from Dr. Chen's group. "There are substantial supplies available throughout this business district, but you are limiting yourselves to locations that are obviously safe and uncontested. We need to be willing to take calculated risks to secure the resources we need for long-term survival." This perspective conflicted with our established approach of avoiding confrontations with other survivor groups and focusing on locations that we could access without significant security risks. Our conservative strategy had kept us alive and relatively safe for over 2 weeks, but it had also limited our access to some of the most valuable resource locations in the area. Carlos supported our existing approach based on his experiences with Morrison's group and other potentially hostile survivors. "We have seen what happens when groups try to take resources by force," he pointed out. "Every time we get into a conflict with another group, we risk losing people and equipment that we cannot replace. Our conservative approach has worked so far, and we should not abandon it unless we have no other options." The debate over resource-gathering strategies continued into the evening and revealed fundamental differences in philosophy between our original community members and some of the new arrivals. These differences were not just about tactics and procedures, but about the basic principles that should guide our survival efforts and community organization. I realized that successfully integrating Dr. Chen's group would require more than just finding space for them to sleep and including them in our meal rotations. We needed to develop new systems for community decision-making that could accommodate different perspectives and approaches, while maintaining the unity and cooperation that had enabled our survival up to this point. Thursday, November 2nd, brought news that forced all of our internal debates into a much more urgent context. Tom's morning radio monitoring intercepted communications, suggesting that multiple survivor groups in our area were planning some kind of coordinated operation for the weekend. The communications were fragmentary and coded, but they included several references to resource consolidation and mentioned specific locations that were uncomfortably close to our warehouse. This intelligence suggested that we might be facing a much larger and more organized threat than Morrison's 8-person group. If multiple survivor groups were coordinating their operations, they might have the manpower and equipment to overwhelm our defensive capabilities regardless of how well we had prepared our warehouse for attack. Dr. Chen's assessment of this threat was based on her interactions with other survivor groups during the week before her group joined ours. There are definitely people out there who view resource gathering as a zero-sum competition, she explained. Some groups have adopted the philosophy that taking supplies from weaker communities is more efficient than trying to gather resources from abandoned locations. If they are coordinating operations, it probably means they are planning something significant. I called an emergency community meeting that afternoon to discuss our response to this potential threat. With 52 people now dependent on our warehouse for survival, the stakes of any security decision had increased dramatically. We could not evacuate such a large group on short notice, and we could not afford to lose a significant portion of our population in a defensive battle. The meeting revealed the challenges of making critical decisions with a community that had nearly doubled in size overnight. Our original group had developed systems and relationships that enabled relatively quick consensus on important issues. But with 15 new members who had different experiences and perspectives, reaching agreement on security strategies was much more difficult and time-consuming. Marcus Webb proposed that we take preemptive action against the groups that were apparently planning operations in our area. If we know they are planning something, we should strike first before they can coordinate their attack, he argued. We have the advantage of knowing their general location and timing. We should use that advantage to disrupt their operations before they can threaten us. This aggressive approach was supported by several members of Dr. Chen's group, but it was strongly opposed by most of our original community members. Patricia spoke for many people when she said, "We cannot start attacking other groups based on intercepted radio communications and speculation about their intentions. That would make us no different from the people we are trying to defend against." The debate over preemptive action continued for several hours without reaching any clear resolution. Meanwhile, the radio intercepts continued to suggest that some kind of coordinated operation was being planned for the upcoming weekend. Time was running out for us to make a decision about how to respond to this potential threat. Friday, November 3rd, brought the breakthrough that changed our entire perspective on the security situation. During his morning radio monitoring, Tom intercepted a clear communication that revealed the true scope of the threat we were facing. The coordinated operation being planned was not an attack on our warehouse specifically, but a general sweep of the entire business district aimed at consolidating resources from all survivor groups in the area. According to the intercepted communications, at least 4 different groups with a total of approximately 60 people were planning to systematically search every business and potential shelter location in our area over the weekend. Their stated goal was to establish centralized control over all resources and to force smaller groups to either join their organization or relocate to other areas. This intelligence meant that our warehouse would almost certainly be discovered and evaluated during their sweep operations, regardless of our defensive preparations or attempts to avoid detection. We could not hide from 60 people conducting a systematic search of the area, and we probably could not fight them successfully if they decided to take our resources by force. Dr. Chen proposed a solution that none of us had previously considered: negotiation from a position of strength. Instead of waiting for them to discover us and dictate terms, we should initiate contact and attempt to establish a cooperative relationship, she suggested. We have valuable medical capabilities and a well-organized facility. Those are assets that could be useful to their larger organization if we can negotiate a mutually beneficial arrangement. This approach offered the possibility of maintaining our community's independence while gaining the protection and resources that came with being part of a larger organization. But it also involved significant risks, including the possibility that any negotiation would result in our absorption into a group with different values and priorities than our own. I spent most of Friday evening considering our options and trying to develop a strategy that could protect our community while adapting to the changing circumstances in our area. The mathematics of survival had changed again with the arrival of Dr. Chen's group and the emergence of larger, more organized threats. We needed solutions that accounted for these new realities while preserving the principles and relationships that had enabled our survival during the past 18 days. Saturday morning, November 4th, brought the radio transmission that would determine the future of our warehouse community. At 8:30 that morning, I received a communication on emergency frequencies from someone identifying himself as Colonel James Mitchell, representing what he called the Denver Area Survivor Coordination Council. Colonel Mitchell explained that his organization was working to establish communication and cooperation between all survivor groups in the Denver metropolitan area. He had been monitoring radio traffic and had identified our warehouse as one of several established communities that might be interested in joining a larger cooperative network. We are not interested in taking over existing communities or forcing anyone to give up their independence, Mitchell explained over the radio. But we are finding that isolated groups are having difficulty sustaining themselves long-term, and that competition for resources is creating conflicts that hurt everyone involved. We think there are better approaches to survival that involve cooperation and coordination rather than competition. This communication represented exactly the kind of opportunity that Dr. Chen had suggested we should pursue. Instead of waiting to be discovered by potentially hostile groups, we had been contacted by an organization that claimed to be focused on cooperation rather than resource appropriation. However, I also knew that claims about peaceful intentions could be misleading, especially when made by groups that had significant military capabilities. Colonel Mitchell's use of a military title and his references to coordination and organization suggested that his group might have very definite ideas about how survivor communities should be managed and what kinds of cooperation would be required. I agreed to meet with Colonel Mitchell's representatives on Sunday, November 5th, at a neutral location where we could discuss potential cooperation without revealing the location or capabilities of our warehouse community. This meeting would determine whether we could maintain our independence while gaining access to the resources and protection of a larger organization, or whether we would need to choose between absorption and resistance. As I prepared for what might be the most important negotiation of our entire survival journey, I reflected on how much had changed since that Tuesday morning when I first felt the ground shaking from the Yellowstone eruption. 18 days earlier, I had been a warehouse manager whose biggest concerns involved delivery schedules and inventory management. Now, I was the leader of a 52-person community that had become a functioning society with its own rules, relationships, and survival strategies. The decisions I would make in the coming days would determine whether our warehouse community continued to exist as an independent entity, or whether we became part of something larger and potentially very different from what we had built together. Either path involved significant risks and uncertain outcomes, but both represented the possibility of survival in a world that had been fundamentally changed by forces beyond our control. The radio crackled that evening with reports from other parts of Colorado and the western United States. The volcanic winter was continuing with no signs of improvement, and temperatures remained at life-threatening levels across most of the region. Agricultural production had ceased entirely, and government authorities were beginning to acknowledge that the crisis might last for years rather than months. But there were also reports of successful cooperation between survivor groups, establishment of sustainable communities, and development of new technologies and strategies for surviving in the extreme conditions. Our warehouse community had proven that ordinary people could adapt to extraordinary circumstances when they worked together and made difficult decisions based on realistic assessments of their situation. As I listened to these reports and thought about the meeting scheduled for tomorrow, I realized that our survival journey was entering a new phase that would require different skills and strategies than those that had brought us this far. The immediate crisis of staying alive through the first weeks of the volcanic winter was giving way to the longer-term challenge of building sustainable communities that could thrive in a permanently changed world. Whatever happened in my meeting with Colonel Mitchell's representatives, our warehouse community had already achieved something remarkable. We had taken 52 people from different backgrounds and circumstances and created a functioning society that could sustain itself under the most extreme conditions imaginable. We had developed systems for resource management, conflict resolution, security, and community decision-making that worked even when the normal structures of civilization had completely collapsed. The notebook I had started keeping 3 years earlier as a simple emergency preparedness tool had become the foundation for managing a complex community with its own economy, government, and social structure. The warehouse management skills I had developed over 12 years of normal operations had translated into the ability to coordinate survival operations for dozens of people facing impossible circumstances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions that would shape the future of everyone who had trusted me with their survival over the past 18 days. But tonight, as I listened to the steady hum of our generators and the quiet conversations of people who had become like family to me, I knew that we had already proven something important about human resilience and cooperation. 31 days ago, I was managing inventory and coordinating deliveries in a world where the biggest challenges involved supply chain disruptions and corporate performance metrics. Now I was managing lives and coordinating survival operations in a world where the biggest challenges involved staying alive from one day to the next. The skills had translated better than I ever could have imagined, but the responsibilities had become far greater than anything I had ever prepared for.